Okay, so this is the pre-recorded lecture for week 3 of social evolution, and this is a really critical lecture where I'm going to introduce you to a few of the theoretical frameworks that have been used for a long time in evolutionary biology and animal behavior to understand and predict how different things can evolve, how these social behaviors can play out. So this is just an outline of the topics we're going to cover. It's sort of a mix of philosophy and these theoretical frameworks. Okay, so just to start with, a couple of comments on adaptationism. So I want to start by posing the question, is the peacock's train ornament an adaptation? It's a classic example of an adaptation that arises through sexual selection, but do we know that it meets all of the premises of an adaptation that I presented in the first couple of weeks? Well, that's really tricky. So let's look at the first premise. Is variation in the peacock's train linked to fitness? Well, there's been several studies that have found that coloration or the size of the ornament can be correlated with a male's mating rate, but fitness per se hasn't been measured in any of these studies. That's really hard to do. Okay, what about the premise of whether the train varies among individuals? Well, yes, males differ in the coloration in the current population, so it definitely varies. But is there a heritable genetic basis to that variation? Well, we're not sure. We haven't tested that, and it's unlikely in the current population that the variation in color that we see is genetically linked. So, that said, we can assume that there would have been heritable genetic variation in this trait in the past. There had to be at some point for it to have evolved. So it's really hard to say, okay, here's an example where we've kind of got solid evidence for all these premises of adaptation from a living current population, because they're really hard to show. And just because something doesn't have heritable variation in now doesn't mean that it didn't in the past. So I present this not because I believe it's not an adaptation. I just want to show you how challenging that can be. Okay, so a few examples of kind of misconceptions about adaptation. The first and biggest one is that animals are like perfectly adapted, but we have so many examples that this isn't true. And a great example is the laryngeal nerve in giraffes. So in giraffes, the laryngeal nerve is about 4.5 meters long. And so this is a nerve that in the ancestors of like mammals and land animals, in fish was a very direct path from the brain to the gills. So it's a very short nerve in fish. But over the course of evolution, as tetrapods took to the land, and as in some lineages like giraffes, the neck became extended and the heart became lower in the body, the laryngeal nerve was caught on the wrong side of the heart. And so natural selection has gradually lengthened the nerve to accommodate for this. And so it takes this like crazy circuitous route. And it's taken to the extreme in giraffes. So the point is, like, it's not useful, or the way, if you were planning a giraffe from scratch, you wouldn't plan this nerve to take this crazy detour, but that's what we're stuck with. So evolution is not an intelligent designer. Not everything about an organism is designed to be perfect. Okay, so just a summary of some of those ideas. Not every trait has a heritable genetic basis. Not every trait has a function in survival and reproduction. All organisms are composed of many traits, and often traits are correlated genetically and developmentally. Few traits are free to evolve independently without affecting something else. Also, genomes, a genome of a species gets expressed in many different individuals, and different individuals might be subject to different selection pressures. And a classic example of that is in females and males. Alleles that are good for female functions might not be so good for males, and vice versa. And so sometimes that conflict can even be detrimental, like an allele that helps a female be successful at like giving birth might actually be detrimental to other functions and might be detrimental to males, for example, or vice versa. Okay, so there's a great classic paper from 1979 about the kind of correcting being overzealous about adaptation. And this is the paper. I really encourage you go read it if you're really keen about this. And the paper's got its issues, and there's some really interesting critiques. But the key message here is to be cautious about being a pan-adaptationist. Just because something exists doesn't mean it's adaptive. Okay, so as an example, another kind of tangible example of that, one of the points on the previous slide, that organisms are composed of a whole bunch of different traits, and these traits have like developmental and genetic linkages, and it's hard to change one trait or have one trait evolve without pulling others along with it. A beautiful example of that is the silver fox domestication experiment, and you might have heard of it in a class on evolution or in animal behavior. But it was this beautiful experiment done in the past century where the researcher, I'm going to say his name wrong, Belyaev, wondered why domesticated animals like dogs, horses, goats, sheep had certain suites of traits that were seen in common in a lot of these groups. They would often have patchy coloration, kind of morphological traits or anatomical traits that are typical of young animals. Like, dogs are more similar looking to wolf puppies than they are in some ways to adult wolves, for example. So why do we see these kinds of traits popping up again and again in domestication? And his hypothesis was that domestication selects on a behavior. It selects on tameness. But that behavior doesn't just change on its own. It is produced by a whole bunch of physiological systems. And so when we select on tameness, we're dragging a whole bunch of other traits with us that often end up producing an animal that's more juvenile-like overall. Okay, so what his experiment did was he took these wild foxes, although there's been some criticism since that maybe they weren't as wild as people thought, and ran this very controlled experiment where these wild foxes would just be selected on tameness. And the question was, would they develop the domestication syndrome in addition to an evolutionary change in their behavior? And indeed, he found that within a few generations, remarkably fast, considering that real dogs evolved from wolves over tens of thousands of years. In this experiment, just a few generations, the foxes gained traits that weren't being selected for, like floppy ears, white patches on their fur, and shorter puppy-like faces. So again, it just proves that point that traits don't evolve in isolation, and so you can't look at an animal and say, okay, all of these traits are perfectly matched to its environment. Okay, so moving on now to one of the other key frameworks about understanding behavior, and this is one that you should be familiar with if you're taking animal behavior, and it's the levels of analysis, proximate and ultimate levels of analysis. Really important terminology on this slide, important for kind of thinking about what different kinds of studies are telling you. And these are complementary approaches. And so one of the key figures in laying out these levels of analysis and these types of questions in behavior was Nico Tinbergen. And he has this excellent paper from 1963 that's like stands a test of time. It's like a beautiful read even today. So I encourage you to read that one too. But he explains how within proximate and ultimate, you can think about kind of two subcategories within each of those two broader levels. And so proximate levels of analysis are questions that look at what are the immediate causes of a behavior. For example, what physiological mechanisms are responsible for it. Under mechanism, you can also think about what stimuli elicit the behavior. The other kind of question that Tinbergen laid out under proximate was development. How does that behavior develop during the organism's lifetime? So describing that kind of change, or when does it arise and how does that happen? What conditions are necessary for that behavior to develop? Those are all proximate questions. But also we can talk about the ultimate level of analysis. And instead of being about immediate causes, the ultimate level of analysis is more about evolution. And so one of the questions we can ask at the ultimate level is, what is the evolutionary history of that trait? Like, when in the history of this lineage did it evolve? How often has it evolved? How long did it take to evolve? And we can also ask about its adaptive value and function. And that question often requires studying the current population. But what we're interested in there is, what effect does that behavior or trait have on an organism's survival and reproduction? So it's like, what is the kind of adaptive reason that explains why that behavior is around? Okay, so just as a little example of part of that framework, we've talked about like our behaviors. Do they have a genetic basis, a heritable genetic basis? Well, that's a proximate question. But lots of really interesting behaviors don't have a genetic basis. For example, there's two on this slide that represent behaviors that have recently arisen in these wild populations through learning and cultural transmission, through like one animal figuring out how to do something, and then other animals in the population copying, and then that really like taking hold and spreading throughout the population. So it spread in these populations that have been studied too quickly for it to have occurred through genetic evolution. But it's still interesting. Like, it's not as though that somehow makes it not social evolution. Social evolution can occur through proximate mechanisms that involve learning. Okay, so the examples are around mid 1900s in the United Kingdom, a lot of people received their milk by delivery, and so the milk bottles would be out on their porches or whatever. And these blue tits, shown in the little images there, figured out how to break into the caps of milk bottles on porches to steal the cream, which is like an amazing food resource for them. And researchers tracked how that trait went from being quite rare at the beginning of the 1920s to just happening everywhere by the late 1940s. And interestingly, it was like originated by more than one blue tit. So there were like two different origin sites. The other example on this slide is another cultural phenomenon, and it's Japanese macaques that wash their food. They have this hygienic behavior where they clean their sweet potatoes. And again, it happened like during a time period where people were intensively studying this population, so they could see how this behavior went from not existing to like spreading. Okay, so we'll get more into culture near the end of the course, but I just want to highlight how the example of this hygienic behavior in macaque monkeys, we can ask both proximate and ultimate questions about it, and they're very complementary. So for example, there's this study that was done a few years ago looking at what kinds of stimuli elicit like food washing behavior or food avoidance behavior in macaques. And this included doing experimental treatments where like little nut treats were presented to the macaques either on pieces of plastic or on pieces of like poop or on plastic poop as the control condition. And interestingly, and they had all kinds of different nuts and seeds that they would try. And interestingly, like if it was kind of a regular old nut, like an acorn, they wouldn't eat it if it was on the poop, but if it was a peanut, that's like really good, and like they'll eat it no matter what substrate it's on. So those are proximate levels, like what elicits the food washing behavior. But we can also ask, and this same study also asked questions that are more ultimate questions in terms of what are the advantages of this behavior. And so one of the other things they did was investigate the parasite burdens of the monkeys themselves. And they found that the monkeys that did more food washing, the ones that were fussier about food hygiene, had fewer parasites in their own bodies. So that's a potential adaptive benefit of this behavior. Okay, so I want to give you a few practice questions. You should work on these on your own, and I'll share the answers later on Brightspace. So these are great examples of potential midterm and exam questions. So identify which of these 4 explanations are proximate explanations and which are ultimate explanations about monogamy. Okay, and another great question refers to a slide I showed in the previous lecture showing how humans who have more friends, who place more value on friendships, are healthier and happier than humans who place less value on their friendships. And also, ants that are isolated in the lab live shorter lives. They die faster than ants that are housed with other ants. So the question is, are these proximate causes of behavior or proximate explanations, ultimate explanations, or neither? And explain your reasoning. So this is definitely tricky. Okay, so let's go on to our third framework that we're going to cover today, and that is optimality models. So optimality models have been used for many, many years in evolutionary biology to try to understand and predict evolution. So they're really asking, what are all the costs and benefits of different possibilities for behavior, and then where along that continuum of possibility do we get the best net benefit? Okay, so that kind of explains that. So an optimality model is just a mathematical expression that seeks to formalize the potential costs and benefits that are involved and try to predict what's that best possible value of the trait or of the behavior. And so these kinds of models can be applied to traits that social evolutionists are interested in, like group size. So an optimal group size would be the number of individuals in a group that would maximize the difference between the benefits and costs of group living. So you want to have benefits minus cost. You want that to be the largest positive value. So here's a graphical representation of this type of model. So we've got the benefits shown on here, and whoever was developing this model would need to figure out all of the potential ways that group size might yield benefits and then formalize them into a function that would describe a curve. And then you've got a cost function. And then what the optimality modeler wants to find is the difference between those functions and the position of the trait along the horizontal axis that gives you the best possible outcome. And that, in this case, is called N optimal group size. And so this is just another example of how we can take that difference and then plot the function of that difference between the benefits and the costs. And what that is called your net fitness payoff. So the optimal group size is going to depend on the form of that function. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples from studies that were done in the past. So this first one is a study of birds called the bobwhite quail, and this is actually data that come from studying the quail. The graphs you see on the left of this slide are real data, they're not models. The lines that you see on the graphs are statistical, like lines of best fit to the data. So we're going to focus on the graphs on the left side that are labeled A and B first. And so researchers studied these quail, and the quail can be found in these groups that are called coveys. Pretty cute name for a group, and the coveys are ranging in size from just like 3 quail to 23 quail, it looks like. So in the graph on the top left that says benefit, they determined the survival rate of quails in these different group sizes, and they found that survival rate peaked on average when the group size was about 12. In the graph on the lower left, labeled B, the researchers estimated the cost, and they estimated the energetic cost of moving around. And what they found was that the really large group sizes had a higher rate of movement, a higher energetic cost involved, and so did the really small group sizes, whereas these intermediate group sizes had the lowest cost, and the optimum from their line of best fit was a group size of about 10. Okay, so if you use that information to parameterize one of these models, you end up predicting that the optimal group size for these quails should be a group size of about 11, and indeed, in the wild, the average group size of these quails is about 11, which is really quite a beautiful match to the model, and it's all very convenient. But it's not always so beautiful, it's not always so convenient. And here what I want to show you is some information from like a decades-old study of lions attempting to do something similar, to estimate what is the optimum group size for lions living in prides, and do the actual group sizes match our theoretical model? So what this table shows you is in this column are some estimates from a theoretical model of prey capture and how much meat would the lions be able to obtain per individual for different group sizes based on like where the different lions live and what prey are available and how hard it is to catch those prey. So they developed this model, they parameterized the model for a bunch of different like regions here, and so those numbers are supposed to be the best possible group size for those different habitats, between 2 to 4. But then when we look at the data from lions actually living in these regions, eating these prey, there's a lot more variation, and in many cases the observed group sizes are a lot bigger than the ones predicted by this optimality model. So that last thing just summarizes that. So it's telling us that there's something deficient from this purely energetic prey capture model. It's not capturing all of the costs and benefits. It's not capturing everything that's going on with these lions. And this graph, it's a bit of an odd graph. It's kind of like a histogram, but kind of a bar graph, is showing you that reproductive success for lions, it seems to peak at much larger group sizes than the foraging optimality model predicts. So the data are divided up into populations from the plains and populations from woodlands. But just what I want you to see is like the best reproductive success is often happening at group sizes of like 7, 11, 12, and so on. So that tells us that, again, this optimality model, just based on foraging, is missing out on something. Now, what could it be missing out on? Well, there could be other factors like parasites, access to the right mates to choose from, access to protection for offspring. So it's not just all about how much meat each lion is able to get. And indeed, for lions, kleptoparasitism is another important factor. Kleptoparasitism refers to stealing of prey. So there are other predators in the places where lions live that will steal their prey, and lion group size can defend against kleptoparasitism. And also, kleptoparasitism is caused by us, caused by humans. So, and indeed, apparently, kleptoparasitism may have been one of the reasons that many large mammals went extinct from other continents in the Pleistocene. Okay, so to summarize, optimalities are not perfect. Often they don't perfectly capture what's going on in nature, which is always much messier. But the value of these models is that they force us to think really carefully about the parameters involved. Do we have the right currency? Are we thinking about all the possible cost-benefit considerations? Also, we have to think about, does the one-size-fits-all approach really make sense? So maybe the costs and benefits of being in a group of size X depend on whether you're the dominant one in the group or the subordinate one. So not everyone in the group is going to have the same costs and benefits. So the decision to join a group is more complex and individual-based than classic optimality models often assume. Also, coming back to questions about adaptationism, do we even expect organisms to be perfectly optimal in the first place? There are lots of evolutionary phenomena that can generate suboptimal outcomes. And some of the examples are listed here of how that can happen. So the key point, though, is, does the optimality model help us understand the observed diversity of phenotypes instead of just focusing on one optimal value? Okay, so moving on now to the fourth and final framework we're going to cover today. If you look at this image, you can think that there are a lot of behavioral decisions happening here. This is a very dynamic scene. If you are a member of this wolf pack, who's going to be the first one to attack and risk injury from this like massive, strong, fast prey? Also, once the prey is isolated and killed, how are the energetic rewards going to be distributed? And so this brings up the second theoretical framework that we need for predicting social evolution, and that is game theory. So just to come back to the survey from class, if we imagine that we are a social group, individuals in our class might differ in our social behavior, our social phenotypes. So this is a mosaic plot showing the relationship between your answer to the question of whether you were social or solitary and the question of whether you were competitive or altruistic. And the areas of these different colored squares represent the proportion of students that answered in each of these possible 4 bins. So a lot of you are solitary and altruistic. That was the most common set of responses. But also a lot of students are social and competitive. And there wasn't a huge sample size. And so it's maybe not surprising that we don't detect a significant association between these 2 traits. But I do have to wonder if these traits are correlated with each other in the broader population. Okay, so that was a little segue, but I want to come back now to game theory. And game theory is really about modeling the outcome of populations when individuals are socially interacting and when these different social phenotypes affect the outcome of these interactions. So what I want you to do now, before you go any further in this lecture, is stop and go watch this 13-minute YouTube video that just beautifully introduces the idea of game theory through a simulated example. So stop and do that right now. I'll put this link in the description to this video as well, then come back and watch the rest of this lecture. Okay, so now that you've seen that great video, a few definitions here. So game theory actually arose in mathematics and economics, and it's a branch of those fields that looks at the outcome of all kinds of interactions, including things like how should businesses compete with each other? How should countries handle arms races? And so the premises are that the individuals don't control the decisions of others, but everybody's decisions entail payoffs, costs, and benefits. And in evolutionary game theory, in biology, these payoffs are surrogates for fitness, and the behaviors or the strategies or the phenotypes of the players in the game can evolve over time, over generations. Okay, so a few other definitions you should know. So in the simplest possible game theoretic models, we focus on pure strategies. Pure strategies means that each individual can only play one tactic. It's almost like saying the behavior you exhibit is like completely determined by your genes. If you have like this allele for this behavior, you can't behave any other way. Those are pure strategies. Like somebody who always plays rock in rock, paper, scissors is playing a pure strategy. However, that's not super realistic. Most behaviors in real life are not completely invariant that way. So we also have mixed strategies, and that's when an individual in the population can play one tactic or another, maybe like a whole bunch of different possibilities for what they can do, depending on one day to the next, or like depending on who they're facing. And so those more complicated scenarios are called mixed strategies. And we're just going to focus on pure strategies for the example in the next few slides. Okay, so in classical game theory from economics and math, a Nash equilibrium is the technical term for the state where no individual would benefit by changing their strategy. And the analogous situation in evolutionary game theory is called an evolutionary stable strategy. It's not a perfect analogy, though. Okay, so a little bit about evolutionarily stable strategies, or ESSs. An ESS is a phenotype or strategy that can reach the state where everybody in the population is displaying or having this phenotype, and it can't be replaced or beaten or invaded by any other strategy under consideration. So a mutant strategy is modeled to be a new strategy that can be introduced in the population. And when we're doing game theoretic models, if the average payoff to the individuals playing let's say strategy number 1 is greater than whatever strategy number 2 is, then strategy number 1 is said to be an evolutionarily stable strategy, or an ESS. Just as an aside, you might often see a similar term, an evolutionarily stable state, has the same acronym if you made it an acronym, but it's not exactly the same as an evolutionarily stable strategy. An evolutionarily stable state is just a state that a population will readily return to after some perturbation. So an ESS in game theory may be an evolutionarily stable state, but the concept of the state is much broader. It goes beyond game theory. It pertains to non-social evolution as well. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So what I want to do now is show you an example of how to do a visual analysis of a very simple payoff matrix with pure strategies. And these examples in the next few slides are just taken right out of that great YouTube video that you should definitely watch. And I'm going to show you how to do this yourself. And this will be something that you'll need to be able to do, for example, on a midterm or exam. So let's say we have a payoff matrix like this for this hawk-dove game, again, following the examples from the video. So the columns are the strategies for the opponent player, and the rows here represent the possible strategies for you, let's say. And within the matrix, we've parameterized it with these different payoffs, like what are the outcomes for all possible matchups of one strategy versus another. And so what you want to do to figure out what's going to happen is to first determine, is there an ESS? Is there a strategy that would be best for you to play regardless of what the opponent is playing? So to do that, first let's take a look. Let's look at like each opponent column in turn. So we'll start with like, what if the opponent is playing dove? Let's look at the leftmost column. And let's compare the payoffs to you if you were up against a dove opponent and figure out which one is better. So we've got, if you're facing a dove and you were playing dove, you'd get a payoff of 1. But if you're facing a dove and you were playing hawk, you'd get a payoff of 1.5. Okay, so clearly it's better for you to play hawk in that situation when you're facing off against a dove. Okay, now we can move on to the second column. If you're up against an opponent playing hawk, let's figure out what it would be best for you to do. So we can again compare the two pink values, and we can see that the best outcome if your opponent is playing hawk is for you to play dove. So where that ends us is that the best thing for you to play depends on, it's different depending on what the opponent is doing. And this is what's called a symmetrical game. I'll show you examples of asymmetrical games in a future lecture, but we can do the same analysis for the opponent and we'll get the exact same answer because the payoffs here are perfectly symmetrical. So if we run through the opponent analysis, if we start with the first row, if the opponent is facing off against you and you're a dove, it's better for the opponent to be a hawk. And if the opponent is facing off against a hawk, it's better for the opponent to play dove. So there's no ESS. There's no one strategy that is the best no matter what. And so what we're going to get is something called frequency-dependent selection. And what will happen in the population is it will evolve towards a mixture of doves and hawks. And we can also solve a series of simple equations to calculate, based on this payoff matrix, how many doves and how many hawks we'll get at equilibrium. We'll see how to do that in a future lecture. Okay, so now let's try changing the payoff matrix. What do you expect? So you can pause the video and try to answer, is there an ESS here? What is it if there is? Okay, so this was just the kind of examples shown in the video, but if we break it down in the same fashion, so let's look at what you should do. Let's look first at what if your opponent is a dove? Okay, it's better for you to play hawk. And what if your opponent is a hawk? Okay, it's better for you to play dove. And we get the same answer if we analyze it from the opponent's point of view because this is a symmetrical game. Okay, so again, there's no ESS here. We change the payoffs, but we're still going to get frequency-dependent selection. Now, we'll get a different percent of hawks and doves at equilibrium, and again, we can calculate this, and we'll cover how to do that in a bit in a future lecture. Okay, Well, let's change the hawk payoff a little bit more. And what happens now, if you do that same analysis, is that if your opponent is dove, it's better to be hawk. And if your opponent is hawk, it's better to be hawk. So, get the same effect looking at the opposite perspective. So all the arrows point to hawk. No matter what your opponent is, it is better for you to play hawk. Therefore, hawk is an evolutionarily stable strategy here in this particular game, this payoff matrix. Okay, so some take-home messages here. The benefits of any given social strategy will depend on the payoff matrix and on the distribution or prevalence of other behaviors in the population. In other words, how common they are. That's a key feature of social evolution. Also, game theory taught us that social evolution can lead to globally suboptimal outcomes. And like the beautiful example of this is the hawk-dove game that pushes the population towards the evolution of aggressive hawks who damage each other. It's possible for an aggressive strategy to evolve as long as it provides an advantage to the individual, even if everyone in the population would be better off in absolute terms if the whole population was doves. So evolution doesn't act to optimize the population as a whole here. It's acting on an individual strategy. And as long as the aggressive strategy is beneficial to the individual, it's going to take over, even if that hurts everybody in the long run. So it's relative fitness, not absolute fitness, that drives social evolution. Okay, so in addition to understanding the examples here, you should be able to do that kind of simple analysis of a payoff matrix with two pure strategies, the way we looked at in the previous few slides. So you can use arrows to identify whether there's an ESS, and if there is, what is it? Also, later on, we'll cover how to calculate the equilibrium frequencies when there's no ESS. And you can look at the video linked within this lecture to see how they do that, but I'll go through a few worked examples of this later on, and I'll provide some practice examples as well. Okay, so again, there's often not one fittest strategy. This is the scenario of frequency-dependent selection. Very often in social evolution, the fitness of a strategy depends on others, how common those others are. Okay, and so we kind of talked about this already, but this paradox where the hawk strategy provides a competitive advantage creates this seemingly paradoxical situation that's referred to as the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. Okay, so I want to pause and show you an example of real-life game theory happening in a wild population.
Out here in California's serene Central Valley, there's a game underway. One animal is locked in a perpetual, unwinnable cycle of rock, paper, scissors. A three-way competition that's been raging for millennia. Meet the side-blotched lizard, named for that patch of dark color on its side. These lizards are all one species, but they have three different colors. You see it on their throats. Some are more orange, others more blue or yellow. Each male lizard has a different trick for getting a mate that corresponds to their color. Orange, these guys are the brutes, the meatheads. Bigger, stronger. They set up territories with lots of females and defend them aggressively. Yellow, these guys are sneaky. They don't try to hold territories. Instead, they hide and then dart in as often as they can for a chance to mate with an unguarded female. Blues have a whole other strategy. They're monogamous. They put all their focus on just one female. Researchers at UC Santa Cruz figured out the game. So here's how it plays out, the rock, paper, scissors part. Orange beats blue. They're bigger and more aggressive. yellow beats orange because oranges can't keep track of all those females. It's easy for yellows to sneak by them. Blue beats yellows because blues are vigilant. Yellows can't fool them. And while we're on these blues, because they're monogamous, they aren't competitive with other blues. They cooperate with each other, make friends. They even warn their blue neighbors when intruders are nearby. See those little push-ups? In fact, they've been known to risk their own lives for other blues. It's called altruism. Even Darwin didn't imagine this could happen. Anyway, you might think that over time, one color would prevail. Like those altruistic blues would win. The whole species would gradually become blue. But with these guys, it doesn't happen. Each color is kept in check by one of the other colors. And if one of the colors starts to fall behind, the females bring it back in line because they tend to prefer whatever color male is most rare that season. So if blues are getting the upper hand, females go for yellows or oranges. If the females were to have a change of heart and stop going for the underdog, well, then one color might win out. Another might disappear entirely. In other words, the species would evolve, change. But for the last 15 million...
Okay, so the side-blotched lizards are this amazing example of a population where a rock, paper, scissors game is being played out in real life. And when you do a game theoretic model of rock, paper, scissors, it has, and assume that each of those is a pure strategy, it has no ESS. This is one possible payoff matrix for a rock, paper, scissors game, and this particular game is zero sum. And there's just no pure strategy here that's uninvadable. If the whole population is playing rock, well, it's easy for paper to invade and start to increase in prevalence. And so here's an example of what those dynamics look like if we let that model play out. So we were modeling these theoretical strategies where like rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, paper beat rock, and you get these fluctuations with this frequency dependent selection, and the population converges towards this mixture of the three strategies at a third each for this particular payoff matrix. Okay, so that's equilibrium that it's moving towards. And so just to remind you, this really key term here that we see very often in social evolution is called negative frequency dependence. It's when a strategy is favored when it's rare. So so it's when the rare strategy is favored. What really blows my mind is that these side-blotched lizards are not the only example we have of a system where there's like 3 different competing phenotypes that are maintained through this frequency-dependent selection. There's other examples of like biological rock, paper, scissors in birds, in like marine isopods, and probably others as well that I'm not aware of. Okay, so some complications. We've looked at these really simple models where individuals are playing pure strategies and they're just encountering each other once, but that's like such an oversimplification of nature. So what if individuals encounter each other repeatedly? Well, we can consider the possibility that individuals could express mixed strategies in those cases where the behavior you exhibit doesn't need to be exactly the same every time you get into an interaction. So in rock, paper, scissors, a mixed strategy could be that I'm random. With a third probability I play rock, with a third I play scissors, with a third I play paper. And that's actually like a very successful strategy. But we could also have conditional strategies, and that's way more sophisticated. For example, you might have a strategy of playing the strategy that your opponent last chose. So again, that's a mixed strategy because you can play more than one thing. And it's also a conditional strategy because it depends, what you do depends on the environment. It's not just kind of random. And we should also note that there can be complex phenomena like negotiation, communication, coordination, and reputation that can all affect the outcome of real life repeated games. So you might, if you know the opponent that you're up against, you might know, okay, this person like loves playing rock, so I know what I've got to do. Okay, so just the last few slides wrapping up here. If you follow this link, You can play a 1-minute hawk-dove game through a Google form, and you're playing against me, and I've already kind of put in my moves. So go and do that. And if enough students try it out, we can look and see how you scored and like how hawkish or dovish you are as a class. And also I wanted to end this lecture by just leaving a few more of these practice examples. So I'm not showing the answer on these slides, but I'll give you the answers later on. So here's one scenario. Can you use the arrow method to identify which one of these options, A, B, or C, is the correct choice for this playoff matrix? And then same idea here, new playoff matrix, analyze it with the arrows and figure out which option is correct. Okay, so last slide here about the kind of philosophy about all this stuff, and that is to be aware of what's called the naturalistic fallacy. The naturalistic fallacy is to think that just because something evolved, it is good. It is good for us, it is good for the population, things like that. And so just because it's evolved doesn't mean it's good. These are words to live by. So we're going to see in this course how animals can engage in cheating, cannibalism, even killing their own offspring. And these behaviors are horrifying sometimes, but they might be adaptations and they might actually be beneficial to the individuals. Also, just because something is beneficial to the individual doesn't mean it's beneficial to others or to the population as a whole, and we learn that lesson from game theory. So again, game theory shows us how traits can evolve that are good for an individual's relative fitness, but bad for the population as a whole. Okay, so ending with a quick reminder, this Friday we'll have our second discussion, our second group assignment. There are 2 papers to read this week. Game theory is relevant here, but the paper by Cook is not a study of evolutionary biology. It's really more a study of proximate mechanisms. And come to Zoom on Friday for to talk about these papers and to answer some questions on another short assignment. Lastly, I've also posted some more practice questions on Brightspace. You can get them on the course home under lectures and videos, so you can practice distinguishing between proximate and ultimate explanations, and I've posted the answers there as well. All right, that's it, so I'll see you on Friday.